Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that gives you competitive advantage, an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world, looking for patterns and early warning signs, and asking how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's March 9th, 2026. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue. How are you?
Good morning, Eric. I'm good, although it's foggy here in Austin on the 25th floor of the Waller. So I'm looking out at pea soup.
Yeah, it's a little gray here today, some spring showers, but also daylight savings time just over the weekend. So that's affecting our sunlight as well. What do you think about daylight savings time? You a fan?
No, let's choose one and go with it. I think we're a long time past needing to send the kids out into the fields to harvest. Heck, even on the farms, it's now done automatically. So I think we can settle on something. I'm not aware of any benefits accruing in modern society for this change. And is it like anywhere close to the top of my list of things that bother me? No. Do I think we might as well just go ahead and choose one? Yes. And so I'm pretty sure that right after the president fixes college sports, we'll get right on to daylight savings time.
I hope so. They've been trying to fix it for a number of years now, and it hasn't gained much traction. So I'm with you. I don't like it that much. Also, going into this weekend, Sunday's the Oscars. Got some movies getting some recognition, and you just came back from a movie premiere as well. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
I did. It's not a premiere because the film we're applying to film festivals, and one of the agreements you make when you apply to a film festival is that will be its premiere. So
Not
yeah,
a premiere. What's the term?
yeah, pre-screening. So let me talk about this. I don't know that we have. There are a couple of women, Megan Jaffer and Katie Hopkins, who during COVID had this idea that they would start interviewing women in national security, a hidden figures kind of thing. Like, let's share the stories of these women that never tell their own. If our listeners are interested, you will be inspired by look up under Iron Butterfly podcasts, and there's a whole bunch of them of some of the most amazing people you've met. And in those stories, you're just going to be like, oh my gosh, there are amazing people around. Well, in addition to the podcast, they decided that they would make a feature film documenting 10 of the women that they talked about. I happen to be one of them, in a movie called The Power We Hold, Stories of Women Spies. And they did a pre-screening for some donors and then friends and family. And I can't believe these two women and what they imagined and did. Because, the imagining's easy. You know me, I can come up with 1,000 ideas. An idea into action. And even though the film was made over the last 2 or 3 years, as every film is a bit old by the time it gets released, I think now is exactly the time. And based on the reaction of the audience, I think it's a really hopeful story for a nation that needs to be reminded that there are good people in public service who want nothing more than to deliver for the American people. So kudos to Megan and Katie. Look up Iron Butterfly podcast. Listen, it'll make your day. And stay tuned for this channel for the release of The Power We Hold.
All right. What are we going to talk about today?
We're going to revisit a couple stories that we talked about last week and add a new one. And I think the overarching theme is that speed is intoxicating. It feels super decisive, but history without legitimacy usually creates the next problem. And so we're going to talk about Iran, where rapid military action is giving us a sense of progress, but I am not sure at all either what we're trying to achieve, or even if we achieve what we want to, whether Iran is going to be able to establish something that gives it legitimacy and chance of further action, even against our view of what might be different. And then we're going to revisit the AI Anthropic U.S. government story, where the supply chain designation that seems to have now happened reminds us that governments and companies are now negotiating power in real time. And third, we're going to talk about the administration's new cyber EO. I think it reveals as much about how government is structured as about how we're going to solve the problem it identifies. So, different issues with the same question underneath: what actually creates durable outcome?
Well, let's get to it.
Can't wait.
So we'll start in Iran. Mojtaba Khamenei, son of the country's previous supreme leader, was selected by the Assembly of Experts on March 8th as his father's successor. Mr. Khamenei, 56, is known for having close ties to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and takes the helm not just as Iran's new religious and political authority, but also as the commander-in-chief of its armed forces. U.S. and Israel continue to hit Iranian military targets and energy facilities, as well as water desalination plants, adding to Iran's worsening water crisis. Nearly 2,000 U.S. targets hit across 26 of Iran's 31 provinces. Iranian retaliation is regional. Iran has struck across 9 countries: Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE. Amazon's Bahrain data center and 2 UAE data centers were hit by drones and all remain offline. A 7th U.S. service member has been lost, this time succumbing to injuries sustained during an attack in Saudi Arabia. The previous 6 were lost from a drone strike in Kuwait and later identified as part of the Iowa National Guard. The Senate has shot down the Cain-Paul War Powers Resolution, largely symbolic but clarifying. Congress is not going to be a check on this.
Yeah.
And crude oil futures over $100 for the first time in nearly 4 years. It's about 50% more expensive than it was before the United States and Israel started strikes on February 28th. Sue, what do you think about where we are a week later and about 10 days or so into this conflict?
On the one hand, we're getting some clarification on the signals that we talked about last week. The not so fast, this isn't going to be what Venezuela was. And so we're now 10 days in. And though we get assertions that things are going super well, the truth is things are still going without much clarity about how they're going to end. I think we do get an answer to that even in Iran, institutions tend to survive leadership strikes.
Yeah.
And that's what they see, with the election is by a process, maintaining the kind of structure they had before. So the regime adapted faster than I think we had been led to believe that it.
Yeah.
Now, whether it is going to be able to operate effectively with all the losses they've suffered, that still remains to be seen. But they have reestablished some elements of their institution. We have a little bit of an answer to the question of what the regional reactions are going to be. And so, I was questioning whether Iran was overreaching with its attacks on neighboring Gulf states.
Yeah.
But they didn't seem to overreact. And their offer to say, hey, as long as you're not supporting what the U.S. and Israel is doing, we'll back off. I think that's an interesting sign of tempering the kind of regional reaction. And we haven't seen huge effect, even if China and Russia are leaping into the fray. And as I would have expected, but I don't think I said out loud, I'm not surprised that Russia is a more vocal player in this than China is, because again, China's interests are economic, and so it's going to sit back a little bit and see how it plays. And Russia is much more about Western democracies and stuff like that. So I think in terms of explosion into something larger, we do see more institutions holding. As far as our coalition, I think my biggest fear is coming true. We just don't have the same friends that we did. And do I think that's harmful or helpful? I don't know. Maybe it's helpful because it isn't instantaneously creating a much larger AOR, but you did see the attack on the embassy in Norway. So, who knows what that's going to turn out to be. Boy, the economic impact is going to show. And so I think that's what we signaled, and I think we're going to see that as a real pressure point. The markets aren't happy. The oil prices aren't happy. And I think that is something that this administration typically responds to much more than questions of legitimacy or purpose. So the fact that is a new pressure point when we already had significant pressure on the US economy in terms of a horrible jobs report and just kind of sustained weakening of our economy. So I think that's something to watch.
Absolutely. I think that affordability is going to continue to be
Mhm.
a through line. It was in the primaries up to this point and will continue as we go into the midterms. And also, you mentioned China, and they're kind of sitting back more interested in economic interests.
Yep.
But in the last 90 days, there have been significant impacts to a lot of their oil imports. I think between Venezuela and Iran, it's almost 25% of their oil comes from those countries. If you add Russia on top of that, it's roughly 40%. They don't have a whole lot of domestic production, which is why we've talked about before. They've led in diversification with
Yep.
solar and wind and some of those other alternative fuels. But what do you kind of see there between the United States and China as some of our actions against those three competing authorities have disrupted some of China's normal oil stream?
Yeah, there's an alternative view of the universe, which I always think is important to consider because this is weird. We're not always right. Um, that says that the Trump administration or President Trump specifically, because he likes to make it clear that he alone is making all these decisions, is playing some sort of game of 4D chess, and this all comes together. That isn't my experience. However, this issue about oil, and if you add up Venezuela and what that affects, the strengthening and or threatening of the Western Hemisphere about, no, 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 your Western Hemisphere, you will not be allowing Russia and China to come in and be a big player. Cuba's a player for that. And then what's going on in the Middle East. Whether it's 4D chess or not, we certainly have created hardship
Yeah.
with those actions for China, for ourselves too in the short haul. But remember, we are actually pretty, if we chose to be, wealthy in terms of our oil supply. But once you launch some of these actions, especially in the way we have, I'm not sure it's predictable how it plays out. But it is certainly true that it is a pressure point for China, particularly because they are so dependent. And then whether the president can use that when he goes and talks to Xi to get some sort of concessions, although
Hmm.
I'm not sure what he's really looking for, get some sort of concessions. Just as an aside, I think he could have probably gotten those without starting a war in the Middle East. But with this old-fashioned thing called diplomacy, or if you don't, we can do this too. But it's that action is certainly in play. And remember, China, for all its bigness, was not in a particularly strong economic position itself either.
Hmm.
It had its own internal challenges. So certainly this has put pressure on them. It'll be interesting to see whether we have the wherewithal to use it for good.
Yeah, we'll see how that plays out in the coming months. I think they're supposed to meet up in April, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken. Some other good news, or interesting, is Iran's foreign minister rejected ceasefire calls on Meet the Press. But Iran's Ministry of Intelligence quietly reached out to the CIA through back channels to discuss terms. The New York Times originally reported that operatives from Iran's Ministry of Intelligence reached out directly to the CIA through a third country's intelligence service roughly one day after strikes began, around March 1st. They signaled openness to discuss terms for ending the conflict. However, U.S. officials said no active negotiations resulted, and Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency quoted a source from the intelligence ministry calling the report, quote, absolute lies and psychological warfare. So you've alluded to this before,
Eh.
and anyone who has watched the Netflix series The Diplomat knows this is practice. So what signals are you watching for here?
Okay, so first of all, can we just say the test of manhood that's on display from both sides right now is super unhelpful? Right? There's like, I'm the most powerful. You will surrender completely to me. No, you are the demon. I will never surrender to you. This is unhelpful rhetoric. Blasting this death from the sky. We will punch you when you're down. I'm like, stop it. Anyway, to get back to your question, yes, I think it is one of the most unseen useful aspects of intelligence and diplomacy together. And it's something that Bill Burns, as the director of CIA under the Biden administration, really was expert at because of his State Department heritage and then coming over to
Right.
be director. Man, if you recall, when we pulled out of Afghanistan, I thought especially at the end of the first Trump administration where we didn't have a lot of friends, I thought we were really in trouble. And that combination of really working the underground professional cadre, yes, there's politics, we have things we need to do, really served us well on October 7th that didn't turn into a much bigger crisis. So that is a huge aspect of what I think global stability uses in order to allow politicians to do the thing they need to do, but still have us working together as a system. That said, it isn't helpful when that conversation pops up to the political level, just as you saw, because then someone needs to say, we're not doing that. We said we'd
Right.
never surrender. So the fact that we can't keep anything quiet anymore isn't being very helpful on this front. And then the other thing is, one of the biggest things that worries me with this rift between what I call the professional cadre, the bureaucracies, the institutions, that I think have been mistakenly labeled with the deep state, which is much more about the power brokers than it is about the humble tin benders, is those institutions have been thinned out in general. So you have fewer people that have kind of historic wisdom and balance and knowledge of all the players. And then the second thing, and this is something I noticed in my run with the first Trump administration, the gap between what the president is setting and policy and what he communicates to the people that are having all those conversations is really wide. And
Hmm.
so even if you have them and you say, don't worry, guys, this is what's going to happen, you could be two conversations removed from what the current decision is. So I'm glad that it's being used. I wouldn't dismiss that those conversations are being held, but I will say that when they're made public, it diminishes their utility. Can I offer one more thing on the war before we move on to
Yeah.
AI? And that is this over to the people fallacy. I mean, maybe we've walked away from it, but we have now seen what has been reinstalled is essentially the same regime and the infrastructure that would have allowed any sort of reconstitution in a different manner. We have effectively destroyed it. Over to the Iranian people to decide feels more like a way out than any sort of reality that we can expect to leave a better outcome than what we went in there with. That's just a comforting line that gives us a way out. Like, we've done our job. We freed you. Now go. Look what else we've done. So just as an aside, what do you think?
I think that's exactly what they're seeing in the message they sent by naming the son, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not a monarchy, but it's a direct descendant and bloodline. If there was real reform and real change, I know he's not going to be democratically elected and they have different other roles and president and whatnot, but this is the leader of their country, right? And those clerics had an opportunity to vote and elect someone different. And maybe he's a different guy. There's plenty of sons who are different than their fathers. King Charles is not Queen Elizabeth, but this is a statement by them. And I don't expect much change because of this. We just cut off one head and they're regrowing too.
Kind of think Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un, right?
Yeah.
There was some hope that because Kim Jong-un was Western educated, that he would have a more open mind to things. And I think it hasn't really worked out that way. So, yeah, I think that's more of a pipe dream. They had the opportunity and they chose. And I think they in part chose because they were under stress. We had decimated any sort of control and they needed to reestablish it.
Also
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
All right.
Good talk.
Good talk. We'll continue to watch it though. Just like last week, some of our information will be dated as soon as we publish. So
Yeah, this is continues to be a horrific information environment writ large, where it's now every player is displaying their agenda so clearly that the average bear has a hard time saying, okay, come on, what's the through line? That's what we're trying to provide, Eric. We're trying to provide the through line. And I think the same signals we talked about last week are still going to play. This is going to be a consequential week.
while Iran is testing whether speed without coalition equals durability, back home we're watching the same dynamic play out in tech. Anthropic's supply chain risk designation just became official, receiving the official DoD designation on March 4th. The designation applies only to Claude, used as a direct part of DoD contracts, so not all commercial uses. For example, Lockheed Martin can't use Claude to develop the next missile or aircraft and has to look to other providers if they want to use AI, stating they expect minimal impacts. Some OpenAI staff are also protesting, and Sam Altman, CEO, admitted the Pentagon deal was sloppy, so he's working to revise it. This validates who you're concerned from last week. I think it was a clever move by OpenAI, but I don't know how long that holds. In government, one is none, and in business, no responsible enterprise puts the entire pipeline to a single vendor. Power of suppliers is one of Porter's 5 forces in strategy, and we were optimistic last week. This is a big escalation, though. And last week, you drew the Palantir parallel, a company that refused early government demands and is now stronger for it. Is Anthropic on that arc, do you think? Or is the political environment different enough that the analogy breaks down?
Yeah, I think you and I were hopeful that since the CEO was going to go in and talk to the DoD, that cooler heads were going to prevail. They were going to
Yeah.
see that the idea of the U.S. designating its own company that it had chosen to be the critical supplier as now a supply chain risk is one, super problematic and confusing for all the people that have already invested. I mean, you can say the words out loud. We're going to not allow that stuff in. I'm just telling you, and you know this, that is really hard to do. It is
Yep.
really hard to unring that bell and to make sure that nowhere does that exist and that things can continue to work with an open AI product. If you could even do a one-for-one replacement, it just isn't that easy because those products, I don't care what stack they're built on, what technical stack, there are differences about them. And so tactically, this is really difficult to affect in addition to the strategic
Yep.
points you made. So is it window dressing? Is it just trying to prove that we're tough? I don't know, but it is a problem. And it's with the technology that we already have so many concerns about. If we rewind it, like even 6 months or so, we were excited about the AI executive order, this notion of trying to come together on the risk issue. You have the DoD do AI.mil that says, if you stay within this, you're going to be safe. And then we could choose Claude. And then now it feels like that's all ripped asunder. What does that mean in general for the continued movement of that? So that's one. So just to refresh the Palantir example, that was a company that the U.S. government was interested in from a national security perspective early on. It invested in it through In-Q-Tel. Then it wanted to behave as though it could control it. And even when the whole idea of In-Q-Tel was, no, we want to create commercial companies that meet our needs, and so we can just buy from them. And so there was tension early on, and Palantir made some calls early on to not do everything the government wanted, and it made that call that said, we have to make sure we preserve our business. So not quite the same call that Anthropic is making, but kind of the same thing of saying, no, we're a business, we get to decide. That all makes sense. And I also like the idea that the government gets to say, thank you very much for your technology. We use it according to our needs. You're the provider of a product, and we're the one that decides on the capability. Where I've come down is in terms of understanding why today is different, and it's an unresolved issue, and that is, I don't think we've yet fully embraced as a nation, whether that's the government or the private sector, that now we've thrown our lots in together. So in the Wayback Machine, before In-Q-Tel and this passion for giving our requirements so that commercial companies built what we needed, what we used to do is go to a company like Lockheed Martin and say, hey, I need you to build us a stealth capability. And they did in secret, and they built it to our specifications. And the government owned the intellectual property. The government could build what it needed, dictate how it was going to be used, and there was no business that was at risk because it wasn't their commercial business that was being exposed with that use. Well, we're not there anymore.
Right.
Right now, the U.S. government wants to use commercial technology because it stays refreshed and because it's cheaper than building bespoke things all the time, and it has real
Yeah.
advantage for supply chain. But in order to do that, it's going to have to make allowances for, no, now those companies do actually have a say, and they can take it away, just like Elon Musk threatened to take away Starlink in Ukraine. So I'm not sure the government has really embraced the notion that it's in partnership now, and commercial considerations, business considerations are a part of that handshake to deliver capability. The other thing is, I used to say, hey, the technology is not the problem. The rule of law governs use. Well, I don't know. Does it anymore? I mean, are we confident that the rule of law is modernly relevant enough to keep things like surveillance of general populations by the US government from happening? Or have we demonstrated that there are big enough holes in the Constitution that someone can squint at and say, prove to me that I can't do it? And in that case, is my argument that no, technology should just be provided and then government will decide how to use it because they're always governed by the rule of law. What happens when that's not the case? And now, does the company have a bigger civic responsibility as almost the voice of the populace? So I think this, and actually when we get to our next topic, is a great example that the government hasn't yet accepted that it is no longer the controller or generator of all ideas and subsequent action. And the private sector hasn't yet realized that they are national security decision makers when they just build stuff. And until we come together and come up with a new construct for shared responsibility and shared recognition that each side of that equation has demands of how it must behave, I think we're going to be forever stuck in this do loop. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's the contract we enter into as part of a society, though, is that you follow the rule of law. If you have an individual who's going to say, I'm going to make these choices unilaterally, then you're not really adhering to the rules of that society. Where I wanted to ask you, and it kind of segues into this, is with Dario, the CEO of Anthropic, and you've counseled and been a mentor for many CEOs and currently are in your role in corporate governance. I wonder how much of this is his inexperience dealing with the government and how they operate. And then also as they scaled, right, from a relatively small business and a startup AI technology into this booming business that
Yeah,
is valued well over, I think it's $350 billion now.
unbelievable.
Anecdotes coming out of the meeting at the Pentagon were that he said, oh, well, if you want to use it for that, just call me and I'll give you approval. If you want to use it for that, just call me. And some of the Pentagon's pushback on that was, I can't call you independently on every single one of these issues. We need to build something out that is repeatable, transparent, and fair, essentially. So what are your thoughts on that from a leadership perspective?
I have thought that a lot of these new companies that are so exciting, right? Anthropic's one of them. I mean, so excited about what they're doing. Anduril is another one, but
Mhm.
they're only two of many that are really exciting entrants into different ways of doing things and thus potential for faster, better, less expensive to fix some of the things that have plagued the government. That it's all fun and games when you're just talking about the capability you could provide. It co it comes to some really screeching realities when, like, "Oh, you mean there's some constraints on that relationship?" Whether
Yeah.
that is, "Did you satisfy the requirements?" or, "I didn't know you were gonna do it for what?" So I think you're right. Some of this is just the speed with which everyone has been able to do their own thing, and now we're trying to have golden spike moments with players that were never part of that before.
Yeah.
But I still will opine that I'm not sure that if you're looking at the government right now, you believe, if you're a company who has its own reputation, that you think the rule of law is the governor it was 10 years ago. And I have seen through this, like when you're in the intelligence community, we have a lot of experiences with what happens when you have exceptional authority and then you escalate your privilege. There's real question about some of the things going through DHS in terms of whether that is Doge collecting data and sharing it outside the limitations of where it was supposed to be, or deployed DHS agents deciding that they're going to take a picture of somebody and put them in a database that labels them as domestic terror. And so I don't think it is 100% unreasonable for a private sector to similarly look at the government and saying, I don't know, are you still being governed by the rule of law? Or are you exerting privilege differently than I want to do it? And so I think that's what I was trying to highlight. I think we're going to have to work on a new agreement because now we have more than one actor who's getting to set the rules. I think my kind of bottom line on this one is you have companies that think they're selling products and governments think they're buying capabilities, and we just haven't solved this mismatch yet. And this commercial nexus and government bespoke is a perfect example of the tension between speed and control. And we kind of want both, but we haven't developed a structure that allows us to get both with a new set of rules. And just kind of as a tagline, for people to remember going forward, I wish I said this at the end, but I thought of it and I might forget, is I think more people breaking rules, and I'll choose my own community, and that is people leaking classified information at an alarming rate. And I've always said that unauthorized disclosure of classified information is always problematic. But I think the more rule breaking you see is an indicator that the rules are not relevant for the times we're in. I've talked to professors at universities, and they are really struggling with how they deal with ChatGPT use when giving people's tests. And so is it cheating, or is it no longer the way the system needs to work to just test facts? And is it thinking that we should go back to? So Sue's word of the day is when you start seeing rampant rule breaking as increasingly the norm, you ought to consider that maybe your rules are no longer relevant for the environment in which you're trying to operate. And it's not that everyone's bad, it's that they're trying to get things done without fixing the underlying structure. I don't know, you wanna throw a flag on that? Do you think I'm wrong?
I'm very much in agreement with the demand signal. You definitely do need to take a look at that. I just think it's a very fine line between people being like, oh, I'm just going to break this rule because it didn't
Oh,
work.
totally agree, but I think that is true in the government case as well as in the private sector case.
Yeah.
And the government has more power to do it. You and I are in violent agreement of that. I'm a big, you don't like the rules? Great, change them. But who exactly, where exactly in America, on the micro or the macro level, do we see effort and interest even in doing something bigger than what I want to do right now? It's how we use information. Why aren't we dealing with information quality issues? In part because everyone's just getting what they want from it. It bothers me because I feel like we have broken systems. I don't know that there are a whole bunch of people out there that are worried about the broken system. So I think you're right. But I think my question is, if we don't name it, where do we put energy into developing new? Even as I'm with you that you don't get to just decide what laws you want to break on either side of government or the private sector or the citizenry.
Well, speaking of government's relationship with technology, the
Yeah.
administration just released its cybercrime executive order and national cyber strategy. So let's talk about what it actually says and, more importantly, what it doesn't. On March 6th, the White House released an executive order on combating cybercrime, fraud, and predatory schemes alongside a national cyber strategy document. It targets cybercrime, ransomware, phishing, sextortion, financial fraud, transactional criminal organizations, TCOs, targeting vulnerable Americans. The key stat that they pulled was $12.5 billion is lost to cyber-enabled fraud in 2024. 73% of U.S. adults have experienced an online scam or attack, and 87% of seniors view online scams as a major problem. So, the EEO is consumer protection forward in a way previous cyber policy hasn't been. The focus on fraud, sextortion, and elder exploitation is less about nation-state threats and more about criminal enterprises preying on American citizens. There's also the Victim Restoration Program reimbursing victims with seized funds. It's a tangible, populist deliverable. The EO creates an operational cell within the National Coordination Center, the NCC. And as I was reviewing that, I asked myself, what is a National Coordination Center? It's an interagency operational command center originally created under Executive Order 14159, protecting the American people against invasion. That was signed into law January 20th, 2025, the day one border immigration AEO. Its original purpose was to coordinate Homeland Security Task Force, focus on dismantling cartels, gangs, and transnational criminal organizations across all 50 states. It's jointly run by the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security, with staffing from DOJ, DHS, and any federal agency with law enforcement or intelligence capabilities, plus state and local enforcement representation. So, what this March 6th Cybercrime EO does is repurpose existing border enforcement infrastructure for cyber. This is a useful point, I think. On the one hand, valuable shifting of resources when no longer needed in an area, but the counter is speed versus institutional design. Whether a command center built to coordinate immigration raids is the right home for coordinating cyber fraud disruption. Also connects back to this plumbing metaphor we've used before. They're running new water through old pipes rather than building the infrastructure the mission actually requires. So, what are your thoughts on this new EO?
Let's put a pin in the financial aspect, which I think is new and is worth talking about. So we'll come back to that. First, there's a little bit of black to me. If I did a bit of a compare and contrast with the Cyber Solarium findings and recommendations that came out, I think in 2019, maybe 2020, again, a product of the previous Trump administration, and kind of continued to be advanced under the Biden administration. Those things were a lot more tangible. The pillars were not particularly different from this. I still feel way too much problem identifying and not nearly enough problem solving. I just don't know what this really did in terms of telling anyone what they're supposed to do about it, either side of the equation. So I don't know. I guess I'm glad we're reminding people that cyber exists as a threat, because I think it is profoundly problematic. I'm not sure that this CEO does much. Now let's get back to the pinned issue. I do like the financial aspects of it. I do think that's new. I do think that's worthy. I do think fraud is huge. I do think the idea of focusing on something that has real effect on the American people, whether that is small businesses or individuals, seniors, as you represent, and then having effort against that is good. It's good. And I like that they've identified it as a consumer protection issue,
hmm
not so much as a national security issue, because national security right now is too often used to put it in a special category where we don't have to tell you as much about it. I think this really is a consumer issue. It costs real money. My head exploded when you said being done in partnership with the DOJ and DHS, two organizations that have just been decimated and had their ranks thinned. And then if you add into that what's happened to CISA, which is not directly relevant to it, but it
hmm
is one of the pieces of cyber expertise, how are we going to make this happen? And then to your last point about repurposing old pipes, the coordination center. Great. I love the identification of it, but that's a great government response. And I'm glad we didn't create something new, for God's sake, because that's our
Right.
favorite thing to do is something's not working. So let's add another thing. I'm glad that we're repurposing it, but does it have the infrastructure? Because even though fraud has the same motivation, whether it's digital or whether it's, mail fraud, it is a very different infrastructure that operates at a different speed. It has different characteristics, and where is the underpinnings to understand it and then develop real mechanisms to counter it at speed in ways that matter. So, yay, kinda. And this is a great example of what I said before is cyber is a partnership between private companies and the US government, and we just are still acting as though the government can just decree something and then magically things are going to coalesce, where the government hasn't offered specificity of what others should do to participate, nor have the others pushed back and said, yeah, I hear that, but I don't know how I'm going to affect that to good things. So I still think we're operating as though government, private sector, and individuals are three different pillars. And that's where our rules are based around them and our permissions are based around that. And a digital area is just thrown those things asunder, especially when operating at sea. So I don't see a lot of solutioning here, but I don't mind the focus. One of the other things we've talked about that we have not talked about today, which is this issue of power being intertwined with privilege, whether that is which companies you like, which institutions you like, which programs you like. So this is consumer protection fraud. I don't see much effort here to look at some of the issues of white collar fraud and ethical fraud. So yay, doing this, but it almost feels like, yeah, but what about the kind of fraud that is being perpetrated by people who have power? And is that power being protected by the power in the government? I worry about that.
Yeah, sure. I like the idea of the repurpose. I don't know that we've seen much data on the effectiveness. I assume their mission is complete with border security because they're being repurposed. And maybe this is a new model of
Yep.
a project team that, hey, they solved this problem. Let's move them on to the next one. But just something to watch for there. And then also, it's just lacking the meat compared to the cyber solarium. But if we also contrast this with the AI strategy
Yep.
that came out earlier, the strategy is 7 pages. 2 of those are title and end pages. Previous strategies were on the magnitude of 40 and 39 pages between Trump 1.0 and Biden administration. Granted, brevity is the soul of wit. Billy Shakespeare said that, but 6 pillars, not a lot of implementation details, and the administration officials saying that it's deliberately high level. More guidance coming out later, compared again to the AI strategy that came with a lot of specifics, timeline, agency assignments, investment figures, export control details, etc. So what does that gap between these two documents
Yeah.
within 6 to 8 months of each other from the same administration tell you?
I think it tells you the administration is getting distracted and just doesn't have the resources to do things in the same way.
Sure.
However, I do think that you and I have pretty much reacted to all this type of executive order, not the ones that target individuals who it deems are enemies of the state, but rather this sort of issue that we know. I think you and I have been broadly supportive of the effort. We love the naming of it and trying to create some things. And even on this one, we like the financial bit and we like the repurposing of something. Let's you and I try and hope that what's coming next is out of the cyber director, perhaps an implementation strategy that's a little more effective and nuancy than some in the past. So, in general, one of the jobs is to set a broad strategy. And in these cases, the EOs have done it, even though this one is a little thinner. And I think it's also going to be thinner because we've been dealing with the cyber issue a long time and we don't have solution. AI, it feels like we have more to say because we've failed less.
Fair enough. So what kind of takeaways do you have from this episode, or what do you want folks to walk away knowing?
Our stories this week, they weren't just about events. It's really questions and trying to show a little bit, not just tell how institutions absorb shock. We talked about how speed creates events, but institutions determine the outcome, that technology is strategic infrastructure, not just industry. Who's got the bigger picture in mind? And government structure does shape what policy could actually accomplish. So we're seeing that kind of played out in the cyber EO, where we're still trying to use the same structure we've had to achieve some new outcomes, and we'll see how that works out. I think if I wanted to be catchy, I'm not sure I'm in the right headspace to be catchy today, but I'd say power isn't what you can do quickly. It's what still works after the headlines go away.
What else you watching?
Everything. I do think this is going to be a consequential week in terms of how the war unfolds. I've kind of stopped holding out any hope for Congress. I think they've had so many chances to throw their hat into the ring as a co-equal branch. I don't know what another week of more will yield, so I think another week of more will have to yield some different decision, but I can't predict what that is gonna be. I'm hopeful that at least the fighting stays regional, but as you pointed out, Eric, the economic impact is gonna be global. And then I spared everyone this at the opening, telling you what, NCAA basketball season, my Duke Blue Devils women won the ACC tournament, and so they're heading into, and so did Texas, won the SEC tournament, huge win for Texas as well. So I'm watching for bracketology next weekend to see where everyone's going to shake out. I hope Navy wins their tournament, Navy women, because that would just make me abundantly joyful to have Duke, Texas, and Navy all in the NCAA tournament. And then the men's tournaments are playing out this week, and so that bracketology will come too. So that's on the fun side. How about you?
What do you think about setting up a UI bracket? All our listeners can join and fill out a bracket if they want and compete against us.
I love it. Let's make it happen. Let's make it happen. Both women and men, just to be clear.
Oh, yeah.
Both women and men. Oh, I think that'd be great. Join us. It'll be fun. Just not putting too fine a point on it. I always choose Duke. On the men's side, I win out about every 5 years by doing that. And women, I haven't won yet, but I'll still choose them.
And then for me, in the words of Tony Kornheiser, happy trails to DHS leadership. Kristi Noem getting promoted out. Fair winds and following seas to her. And good luck to Senator Mark Wayne Mullen coming in at a consequential time. There's partial funding for DHS right now. There's also reported longer lines at TSA checkpoints and things like that as they start to continue to weather through, and some more accountability for DHS.
Yeah, I think you and I always hope for good outcome for America. So if Senator Mullen is confirmed, I hope that he takes this moment that he is fraught and is able to deliver both for the department and for the nation. So yeah, I always hope for good outcome for America.
Well, that's what we're watching and how we see it. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
So thanks for joining us. We'd love to hear what you think of our direction, focus, and insights. There are links that you can drop us some feedback. We do take it seriously. And join us next week and each week for the Understandable Insights podcast, wherever you listen. And as always, go forth, do good, and for goodness sakes, be kind to one another. It really does make a difference.